Right, in this video we're going to talk about exposure, we're going to analyse these key quotations, and then we're going to talk about how you can link exposure to lots of the other poems. So we begin with the personification of nature. The key quotation here is "Merciless icy winds that knife us." This presents to us that nature's attack on humanity is intentional and it's deliberate. It's like a human force that's kind of seeking them out. We've then got the adjective merciless to describe nature, suggests it has no kindness, it's relentless in its attack, and it's unforgiving. And then we've got this quite violent verb of kniving humanity, and this illuminates the sense that nature is hostile and aggressive and physically affecting the soldiers. If we talk about slowly our ghosts drag home, the metaphor of the soldiers becoming ghosts exemplifies how conflict forces them to become these numb, lifeless individuals where they've lost maybe their soul and therefore their purpose. And they feel like they're already dead, and maybe that they can't be seen by people externally. And then we've got the adverb slowly and the verb drag. Both of these words just kind of emphasise how reluctant and hesitant they are to move anywhere, and even homeward. This line, "but nothing happens," as we know, is repeated throughout the poem. It's repetition, but it's also what we would call a refrain because it's the whole single line that's repeated. There's lots of ways to read this line. Obviously, it emphasises the boredom and monotony of war through the repetition. It's the same thing over and over, right? But the idea of it is that they're just constantly waiting for this attack that never comes, and you can think about the psychological mental impact of that. And then finally, really what Owen is saying is that the war is futile because nothing changes, and they just continue. The cycle continues, and they continue suffering and dying, and then that's kind of the general emphasis of the whole poem. The last thing I want to comment on is the use of first person plural pronouns throughout the poem. Because this poem is not about an individual, it's about a collective group of people who are united and together. Which maybe isn't a good thing, but they are united. There's a sense of universal experience of soldiers and that they're united even in their suffering. So we're going to start by comparing it to Storm on the Island. Really, if you're going to compare it to Storm on the Island, you're probably looking at nature or a question about power, but then also it is about conflict because it's the conflict between nature and humanity. So there's lots of ways to link these two poems. I'm going to start with the idea of the collective group of humans that are fighting against nature. So this is obviously a similarity. There's an idea of collective suffering because of the power of nature, but also the idea that a group of people are maybe united against nature even though it is winning. So that's obviously a similarity. We're going to look at a difference now. We've got nature in exposure is described as kniving the soldiers, and then we have nature in Storm on the Island as like a tame cat. So what we have is that exposure personifies nature as a human force, whereas in Storm on the Island Heaney uses the simile to present it as animalistic. However, going back to another similarity, both poems emphasise the destruction that nature can cause. It is not a positive force in either poem. And we've got that with this idea of them becoming ghosts and obviously being attacked, nivus, and then versus the idea that they become afraid by the end of the poem. The final difference is looking at the two poems in We Are Prepared, in that Storm on the Island, they initially underestimate nature. They feel that they're, at the start of the poem, ready for it. However, in Exposure, even right from the beginning of the poem, they begin aware of the impact of nature. Our brains ache. Now we're going to compare it to the Prelude, which obviously is William Wordsworth, and again, it's that kind of conflict, nature, power is how you would compare them. So we're going to begin with a difference between the two poems, and really what we want to think about is how nature in the Prelude has a positive aspect to it. It has this duality, these two sides. It can be comforting, and especially at the beginning of the poem, it starts as a kind of positive force for the speaker. However, in Exposure, violent straight from the start. As I said in the last one, our brains ache in the merciless icy winds. So it's always a violent force in Exposure. However, in both poems, especially when nature becomes the aggressor, nature is presented as a living force. So we've got Nivus, and then we've got upreared its head. In the prelude, it also mentions about how it's like a living thing and strode after me, like it was following him. So lots of allusions to nature being this human force. If we go on to another difference then, in exposure, they have this one kind of view of nature as this causing ongoing suffering for the soldiers, whereas in the prelude we do get those conflicted feelings. We've got troubled, the feeling of guilt he feels, but also the pleasure that he gets around nature. And finally, I just wanted to comment on one more similarity, and that is the violence that nature can hold and the threat that nature can hold against humanity. So with the Merciless Icy Winds and the Huge Peak Black and Huge. Now we move on to Ozymandias, which is obviously another poem that is related in terms of nature. Not so much conflict, but definitely the power and strength of nature. So we'll start with a similarity. Both poems present nature as a destructive force. I suppose you could argue that in Exposure it's currently destroying them, and whereas in Ozymandias it's a destructive force in the past tense. Another difference is that Ozymandias, he initially underestimates nature, he thinks his power and his stature will last forever, king of kings, versus the understanding of nature's destruction and violence in Exposure. A similarity is that ultimately in both poems nature defeats humanity. We get the sense that the poem ends in Exposure, that the humans are never going to win, and then in the same way Ozymandias ends with nature outlasting humanity. And then a final difference, we do have the collective group against nature versus the single individual against nature in Ozymandias, but I also want to use those quotations to tease out a difference in terms of the kind of the way humans view nature, because in Exposure what we definitely have is this humility, this understanding, versus we have the arrogance and pride in Ozymandias. So now we're moving away from nature and therefore power and conflict, and we're moving on to war as a theme that you could link in Exposure. Now, Charged Light Brigade is a poem that is very different to Exposure, okay, but it is still one you could use to make similarities and differences. So we'll begin with the way that we view the soldiers, or are encouraged to view the soldiers. We have in Charged Light Brigade, they are heroes as a result of the conflict they experience, whereas what happens to them in Exposure is that they become ghosts. I still think that Owen, definitely respects the soldiers for what they've done, for what they're fighting, but they are corrupted by conflict rather than becoming these heroic figures. In both poems then we have Merciless Icy Winds at Nivus, and then we've got the Jaws of Death. In both poems you get the sense that the setting, the place where they're experiencing the conflict, is almost alive against them. It's almost swallowing them up in Charged Light Brigade and obviously attacking them, knifing them. In one case it's the weather, in the other it's the battlefield. But definitely you get the sense that their surroundings are attacking them or causing kind of suffering for the soldiers. Which I suppose leads us on to another similarity, which is the fact that in both poems the soldiers have a lack of choice in their suffering, and they're kind of, we've got this sense of inevitable loss in both poems, but nothing happens theirs but to do and die. The final difference I want to comment on is just overall in each poem that they're written for very different purposes from Tennyson and Owen. Charged Light Brigade is a much more patriotic poem that perhaps is more upbeat about war, whereas Exposure is a much more critical attack on the futility of war, perhaps because of the different time periods. We're sticking then with war and conflict, and we're moving on to comparing Exposure to Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. So I want to think about this idea of ghosts versus the metaphor of dynamite. In both cases we get this sense that soldiers are becoming dehumanized by war. Their humanity is being taken away from them in different ways. If we talk about the pressure in each poem, both poems create pressurized environment, but Bayonet Charge, that's established through the heat imagery throughout the poem, and in Exposure it's the freezing cold in the poem, but they're both in situations of pressure. In both poems we get the sense that the soldiers are losing their purpose, losing maybe their patriotism, and that's kind of shown to us through the idea of but nothing happens, it's just kind of this pointless monotony, versus in Bayonet Charge they're dropping their purpose, drop like luxuries. You could also link in Is it that we are dying? What do we do? The rhetorical questions in exposure would work there nicely. And the final difference is that exposure is about a group of people, whereas bayonet charge is about an individual experience, but both of them are universal to an extent. Now, two quite different poems, but ones that you could link in interesting ways. We've got Exposure and then Duffy's War Photographer. Both are about the suffering and pain that conflict and war can cause. We've got Spools of Suffering and we've got Slowly Our Ghosts Drag Home. Both of them exemplify the pain caused by conflict. However, they're different in terms of when that pain is generated, I suppose. But what you could argue is that on the one hand, in both poems, there is this reference to home and versus the places of conflict, and both of those are displayed. However, I suppose that this is slightly different in that the War Photographer takes place once he's left, and then it kind of looks back. If we look at the idea of where the conflict is coming from in Exposure, it's much more a conflict that is coming from nature, whereas in War Photographer the conflict is much more the kind of typical physical conflict. And we've got this idea of the group versus the individual experience, but what you also have is soldiers who are very immediately within war versus a much more external perspective with the photographer who's not within the conflict. Next up, Poppies, which again, quite a different poem, but one you could definitely link with Exposure. So the first difference is that in Poppies we're talking about a post-war impact, and this is a similar sort of difference that I was going to talk about for War Photographer, whereas Exposure is still ongoing within the war. It ends with them very much still present within that conflict, so that sense that it's much more ongoing. Then I want to talk about how the people who are associated with conflict are presented. In both cases, the speakers are fragile. She is leaning against something like a wishbone, the fragility, that fragile image there, and then obviously the soldiers in Exposure becoming ghosts. The other thing is that I suppose it's a kind of obvious difference, is that in Exposure, the thing that he's battling with is nature. It's a very immediate battle, whereas Poppy's, the thing that she's trying to battle against is the loss after war, and to kind of come to terms with the emotions that involves. But a similarity about both poems is that they both emphasise the tragedy of war, and they're both a criticism of what war can do to individuals, whether it's the family at home or the soldiers in the moment. The final poem I'm going to link to is Remains, which tends to be a poem that students enjoy, so it's a good one to be able to link. I'm going to start with the impact of war. Both poems about the impact of war, and really more specifically the mental impact of war. So we've got the idea of them becoming ghosts, versus in Remains, Armitage emphasises how the memories of war get dug in his mind. So it's much more about the mental impact. However, a difference is that Remains is about after the war, and we're talking about when the soldier, the individual, gets home. Exposure is that is still ongoing, and the impact is happening in the moment during the war. A similarity, what we have is that war has a permanent, ongoing impact, regardless of whether they're within it or home. They can escape it. This kind of cycle. That could link to the probably are and possibly not as well, the repetition of bloody. We've got this sense that both of them are trapped in this cycle that war creates. And then finally you have an individual versus collective experience. So there are lots of poems you can link to Exposure, and there's lots you can say about those Exposure quotations. Hope that was useful.